Very few series are as consistently great as The Legend of Zelda. Beginning nearly 40 years ago, we've received a total of 21 mainline entries, and almost all of them have an argument for being someone's favorite. I'm going to rank all of these games based on how much I personally enjoyed each game. No remakes, remasters, or spinoffs will be included, so let's get started. Number 21, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. When you're ranking every Zelda game, something has to come in last, and for me, that's Zelda 2. Not because it's a complete disaster, but because compared to the rest of the series, it's the one that feels the most out of step, the most frustrating, and honestly the least fun to go back to. The first big problem, the difficulty. Now, Zelda games are supposed to challenge you, but Zelda 2 doesn't just challenge, it punishes. Enemies constantly respawn, their attack patterns are relentless, and the game throws you into situations that just feel unfair rather than skill-based. On top of that, losing all your lives sends you back all the way to the beginning of the game, not just the dungeon you were in. Not even the area, you're literally kicked back to the starting palace. It makes every mistake feel 10 times worse than it needs to be, and it kills the motivation to keep pushing forward. Then there's the overall design. Unlike the original Zelda, where exploration felt exciting and rewarding, Zelda 2 is confusing to navigate. The overworld is bland, the random enemy encounters are tedious, and progress often depends on extremely cryptic requirements. You'll find yourself wandering endlessly, not because you're uncovering secrets, but because the game refuses to give you even a hint about where to go next. Unless you have a guide, the pacing grinds to a halt. The side-scrolling format is just another mixed bag. On one hand, it was a bold experiment, but it comes with stiff controls, awkward hit detection, and platforming sections that just feel clunky. Combat boils down to crouching and stabbing enemies over and over again, and while techniques like the downward thrust are satisfying the first time you pull them off, the novelty wears thin. Compared to the fluid action and clever puzzles the series would later be known for, this entry feels more like a grindy NES action game with a Zelda coat of paint. Even the RPG-like leveling system, which sounds good on paper, ends up being more frustrating than fun. You're constantly farming experience points, but dying means you can lose that progress instantly. Instead of feeling like growth, it feels like wasted time. To its credit, Zelda 2 did give us a few important series staples: Dark Link, the magic meter, towns with NPCs, but the trade-off is a game that's more remembered for its difficulty spikes and weird design choices than for the joy of playing it. So why is it last? Because when I think about replaying Zelda games, this is the one I dread the most. Every other Zelda game in the series, even the ones lower on this list, has something that makes me want to revisit it. With Zelda 2, it's more of a history lesson than a fun time. It's a fascinating experiment, but one that's just too punishing, too confusing, and too far removed from what makes Zelda special. And honestly, a remake could save this. With modern design choices, better controls, and fairer difficulty, this game could be from being the black sheep of the series to maybe even being a solid game. But as it stands now, it's an entry I respect for trying something bold, but I just don't enjoy playing it. Number 20, The Legend of Zelda. Now you might be wondering, why is the game that started it all this slow? After all, the original Legend of Zelda is one of the most important video games ever made. It laid the foundation, not just for the series, but for the entire action-adventure genre. But here's the thing. Importance doesn't always equal enjoyment in the big 2025. The truth is, this game has not aged gracefully. Compared to every Zelda title that's came after, it feels incredibly bare bones. The story is almost non-existent. You just rescue Princess Zelda, defeat Ganon, save Hyrule. That's it. And while later games added rich lore, memorable characters, and cinematic moments, this one just drops you into a dangerous world with a wooden sword and wishes you good luck. And some of you may like that style. I personally like when the Zelda games are more fleshed out. But that sense of open world freedom was groundbreaking at the time, but without more modern design choices, it often feels less like exploration and more like wandering aimlessly. The game gives you virtually no direction. You'll spend long stretches of time walking around the overworld, fighting the same handful of enemies, desperately hoping you stumble onto a dungeon or some kind of clue. And when you finally do find one, the dungeons themselves are very simple, blocky mazes with repetitive enemies and very little visual distinction. And again, I know some people like the style of wandering around until you find something, but unlike something like Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, where there's a lot more content, different regions, and a sense of direction, the original Zelda lacks that. On top of that, much like Zelda 2, the original is notoriously cryptic. Key items and secrets are hidden in ways that make little sense without outside help. Bomb this one random wall, it's just trial and error design at its peak. And unless you're using a guide, it can feel like less of an adventure and more like guesswork. Back in the 80s, I'm sure this was a lot more fun, but as someone born over a decade and a half after this came out, I've just never been able to get into it. And look, it's not fair to bash the game entirely, because for its time, this was revolutionary. revolutionary. It was one of the first console games to feature a save system and allow for an adventure that spanned dozens of hours instead of a single sitting. It introduced so many of the series' core ideas like dungeons, items, exploration, and the overall blueprint of what Zelda would become. Without this game, we wouldn't have Ocarina of Time, Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, or really any other game in the series. But when you're ranking these games against each other, you have to judge them by how fun they are to play today, and compared to the incredible worlds, puzzles, and stories that Zelda would go on to deliver, the original just doesn't hold up nearly as well. It's a game I respect deeply for its legacy, but not one I find myself wanting to replay for long stretches. Number 19, The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords. The first true attempt at making Zelda into a co-op experience, it's one of those experiments that's more interesting on paper than it is in practice. The biggest issue is simply accessibility. Unlike Triforce Heroes, which at least gave players the option of online play, Four Swords was locked behind local multiplayer only. That meant you needed multiple people with Game Boy Advances, multiple copies of the game, and the infamous GBA link cables just to get a session going. And even back when the game was new, finding 3 other people who could check all these boxes wasn't exactly easy, and for someone who grew up a little after this, it was nearly impossible to get 3 other people on this. But what about the game itself? Well, it's interesting. The dungeons are randomly generated, which makes each playthrough feel a little different, and gives the game a surprising amount of replay value for a Zelda title. The story, while simple, is stronger than what we later see in Triforce Heroes. Splitting Link into 4 and solving puzzles together adds a unique twist to the formula, and there's definitely some charm in coordinating with friends to figure things out. That said, most of my criticisms of Triforce Heroes also apply here. The puzzles aren't as clever as in the mainline Zelda titles, the combat can get repetitive, and the overall experience just doesn't feel as satisfying solo. And since it was originally bundled with A Link to the Past GBA port, a lot of players, including myself, spent way more time in that adventure than playing this. I know I've been a little harsh on Four Swords, but I do think it's a solid game. The dungeons have replay value, the story is a little more engaging than the previously mentioned games, and the concept feels more exciting for its time. I don't love it, but I can at least respect the ambition behind it. Honestly, this is another game I think deserves a second chance. If Nintendo actually re-released this on Switch 2 with proper online functionality, I think a lot more fans would finally get to experience it the way it was meant to be played. It would never shoot up to the top of the Zelda rankings, but it could go from being one of the most overlooked entries of the series to being a fun side game in the series. And number 18, Triforce Heroes. The first game on this list I actually played at launch. Triforce Heroes is another multiplayer game in the series. This came out during a really rough period of time for Nintendo when there really wasn't much to look forward to. Super Mario Maker had just come out and was great, Splatoon came out that year, and a handful of other quality games had been released in the past year. However, by this point, the Wii U era was ending and most of the best 3DS games had already been released. Triforce Heroes was a fun game, but it didn't really feel like a main series Zelda game. One of the big focuses of the game are the cosmetics you can wear, which also have their own abilities they give you. Like, okay, that's interesting, I guess. There's a hub world you go to called Hytopia, where you have all the stores and places, and of course, where you actually go for matchmaking. And you have 3 options for how to play. You can play solo, but you have these creepy, lifeless Link dolls you could swap your control over. Then there's also random online matchmaking, or you can play with friends both locally or online. I remember this time very vividly as I played it when it came out. I was still in middle school at the time, and my friends and I used to carry our 3DSs around, mostly for Street Pass when that was a thing, and Smash 3DS. But when Triforce Heroes came out, I would play it with friends when we had time, or I'd bring it to a friend's house to play. That's the type of game it is. Casual pick up and play for a bit game that you didn't need to take too seriously. There are games that should be like that, but I just didn't really like it too much as a Zelda game. It has a pretty bare bones story and had really nothing outside of fairly simple dungeons. Plus, if you played it with randoms, you had a very limited means of communication. There was no chat or voice, just a few reactions you could do. I personally prefer it to Four Swords though, just because it's a lot more accessible. While you needed 3 people in the same room as you, and the clunky GBA cables, 3DS had wireless and online connection, making it much more streamlined. And number 17, Four Swords Adventures. Coming off the heels of Four Swords and Triforce Heroes, you probably saw this one coming. Four Swords Adventures takes the multiplayer Zelda idea and tries to refine it, this time on more powerful hardware, the GameCube, instead of the GBA, and really the 3DS as well. And to its credit, it really does make some improvements. The visuals are sharper, the gameplay is smoother, and the overall presentation feels much closer to what you'd expect from a console Zelda title. Contrary to what its name suggests though, this game isn't a direct sequel to Four Swords. It actually takes place much later on the Zelda timeline, but structurally it's still very similar to its predecessor. The main objective is to gather enough Force Gems to empower the Four Sword, and once you collected enough, you move on to the next stage. It's more of an episodic setup compared to the grand adventure the series is known for, and that's really the core issue with Four Swords Adventures. It's a Zelda stripped of that wide open sense of adventure. Despite the word adventures in the title, this game is incredibly linear. Instead of exploring an overworld full of secrets and stumbling onto hidden caves or side quests, you're funneled through bite-sized stages with clearly defined defined goals. It plays more like a series of Zelda-themed mini-missions than a full-fledged journey through Hyrule. So while Four Swords Adventures is definitely a step up from Four Swords, it still doesn't capture what makes Zelda so special. It's a more polished experiment, but ultimately it feels like a side project rather than a true mainline adventure. That's why it lands here on the list, better than its predecessors, but still far from the heights the rest of the series has to offer. Number 16, The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass. Released in 2007 for the Nintendo DS, Phantom Hourglass is the direct sequel to Wind Waker. It continues that charming cel-shaded art style, but shifts the action to Nintendo's handheld. What makes this game stand out is its control scheme. You don't use the D-pad or buttons to swing your sword or aim items, but instead rely almost entirely on the touchscreen, and surprisingly, it works better than you'd expect. Drawing paths for your boomerang or plotting routes for your boat feels clever and fresh, but I 100% prefer traditional controls. Structurally, it takes the same concept as Wind Waker, traveling between islands by boat, exploring dungeons, and piecing together the story, but since it's on the DS, it's a scaled-down version of that idea. The overworld feels smaller, the dungeons are shorter and more linear, and the scope is definitely more limited. The game's biggest drawback, though, is the infamous Temple of the Ocean King. This dungeon is the backbone of the entire adventure. You have to revisit it multiple times, each time progressing a little further with new items, but it's also timed, and every trip starts to feel repetitive fast. Instead of feeling like progress, it feels like padding, and it's one thing that holds this game back from being higher on the list. That being said, Phantom Hourglass still has plenty of positives. It looks fantastic for a DS title, with a story that translates surprisingly well to the handheld. Exploration is fun, the touchscreen mechanics add some creative twist, and the game clearly has a lot of love put into it, making Zelda work in a brand new way. It's far from being perfect, but if you have a DS or 3DS, it's still worth playing. Before I get to number 15, if you're enjoying this so far, be sure to subscribe. Number 15, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Seasons. In 2001, Capcom teamed up with Nintendo to create two Zelda games for the Game Boy Color, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, and much like Pokemon, they released side by side with a link system that connected the two stories together. Oracle of Seasons is the more action-focused of the pair. Its big gameplay mechanic is the ability to change the seasons at will. Winter might freeze a lake so you can cross it, spring might make vines grow to open up new paths, and autumn can drop leaves to form bridges. It's a clever idea that keeps the overworld feeling dynamic and ever-changing. Compared to its counterpart, Ages, this one is generally considered easier and more combat heavy. The puzzles aren't quite as intricate, but the action is faster and it feels closer to the classic Zelda formula established by games like A Link to the Past. It's a really fun adventure, and for anyone who enjoys the more straightforward Zelda style, Seasons delivers exactly that. Number 14, The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages. If Seasons was the action game, Ages was the puzzle game. This one's gimmick is time travel. You can switch between past and present to solve puzzles and access new areas. It's a mechanic that feels a bit more complex and engaging than seasonal changes in Seasons, and it adds a layer of strategy to the exploration. The dungeons in Ages are also a little more challenging, with a heavier emphasis on brain teasers rather than just combat. It's generally considered the harder of the two, and for me personally, that's why it edges out Seasons. I just enjoy the more puzzle-driven approach, and the time travel mechanic feels a little more interesting to mess around with. Both Oracle games feature 8 dungeons, plenty of secrets, and that classic 2D Zelda feel. They also tie together in a really clever way. If you beat one and then link it with the other, no pun intended, you get access to the true ending and an extra final boss fight. It's a cool touch that makes the pair feel like a bigger, interconnected adventure rather than two totally separate games. At the end of the day, you can't really go wrong with either Oracle title, but I give Ages the slight nod because of its stronger puzzles and mechanics. Number 13, The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. Released in 2009 for the DS, Spirit Tracks is essentially the follow-up to Phantom Hourglass, and it improves on that game in almost every way. The touchscreen controls return along with the same cel-shaded art style, but this time you travel not by boat, but by train. And honestly, I think the train is a much better fit for the DS. It's more structured than aimlessly sailing the seas on the small screen, and while some people find the restricted tracks limiting, I think it gives the game a stronger sense of progression and makes the traveling more fun. Like Phantom Hourglass, you've got a central dungeon you keep returning to, but thankfully it's handled much better here. Instead of starting over and slogging through the same floors over and over again, Spirit Tracks lets you skip ahead as you progress, making each visit feel fresh rather than repetitive. Another big highlight is Princess Zelda herself in this one. This is one of the only games where she plays an active role alongside Link. Her spirit can inhabit phantom armor, and together you solve puzzles in creative ways. It adds a real sense of partnership that feels unique within the series. That's not to say it's perfect. The dungeons are still fairly short, and the linearity of traveling by train does limit that sense of freedom we all associate with Zelda, but overall Spirit Tracks feels like a more polished and more enjoyable version of Phantom Hourglass. It's not a top tier Zelda, but it's a very charming one and definitely worth checking out if you've never given it a shot. Number 12, The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom. The newest Zelda title on the list, Echoes of Wisdom comes in just short of the halfway mark. For the first time in the series, you don't play as Link. Instead, Zelda herself takes the lead. That alone feels like a historic shift for the franchise, and while it's too new to judge its long-term impact, it's already clear that Nintendo was willing to take some risk with this one. The core mechanic of Echoes of Wisdom is fittingly echoes. Rather than collecting traditional Zelda items like bombs, bows, or hookshots, Zelda can create echoes of objects and enemies she's encountered to solve puzzles and fight her way forward. It's a creative twist that gives the game a very different flavor, focusing more on clever problem solving than on raw combat. The art style also continues in that charming toy-like direction we saw in Link's Awakening on the Switch, which I know is controversial, but I personally really enjoy this art style. So why does it land here just outside the top half? I really did enjoy it, but it's also hard to compare it with other games that I've played either multiple times or I've had a lot of time to think about since I played this very recently. So maybe in the next couple years it goes up, maybe it goes down, but we'll have to see. For now, it's going at number 12. Number 11, The Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening. Whether you've played it on the original Game Boy, the DX version on Game Boy Color, or the recent Switch remake, which is how I played it, Link's Awakening is an absolute classic. Right from the opening cutscene, Link is stranded on a strange island with a giant egg looming on top of a mountain. You can tell this isn't your typical Zelda adventure. The tone of the game is different from really almost every other Zelda game in the series. There's an odd dreamlike quality to Kowloon Island. Enemies from the Mario series pop out of nowhere. The characters you meet are quirky and a little unsettling, and the soundtrack perfectly complements the strange, otherworldly atmosphere. It all builds towards one of the most memorable twists in any Zelda game, one I won't spoil here, even if most of you probably know it by now. On the gameplay side, Link's Awakening is as solid as you'd expect for a 2D Zelda. For a Game Boy title, the dungeons are well designed, the pacing is excellent, and it feels remarkably complete for a handheld adventure. Of course, being a Game Boy game does mean it's a little limited in scope, which is why the Switch remake is the definitive way to play. The remake doesn't just add updated graphics, it makes the world feel more alive and preserves that mysterious, dreamy tone while modernizing the experience. Whether you play the original or the remake, Link's Awakening is a fantastic Zelda game that shows how creative and experimental the series can be, even on limited hardware. Number 10, The Legend of Zelda, Skyward Sword. Now here we are, the first 3D Zelda game to be shown in this video. I do love Skyward Sword, but there is a reason I prefer the other 3D Zeldas. The first major issue is just how linear it feels. Zelda games usually give you a sense of discovery, of wandering off the beaten path and finding your own way. Skyward Sword, however, is much more structured. It often feels like you're being guided straight from point A to point B with little room for freedom. That doesn't make it bad, but it does make it feel more restrictive compared to the open worlds of games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and even games like Twilight Princess. Then there are the motion controls. The entire game was built around the Wii Remote's motion sensors, requiring precise swings for combat and puzzle solving. In theory, it's an innovative idea. In practice, it often feels clunky and forced. Unlike Mario Galaxy, where motion controls were simple and subtle, Skyward Sword made them the foundation of the whole experience. And the Wii Remote just wasn't precise enough to pull it off flawlessly. It doesn't ruin the game, but it can be frustrating, especially in tougher battles. And of course, I can't talk about this game without mentioning Fi, your ever-present companion who constantly interrupts you with explorations you didn't ask for. It's one of the most common complaints about this game, and for good reason. But here's the thing, Skyward Sword also has a lot of strengths. The art style is beautiful, a blend of Twilight Princess's realism and Wind Waker's cel shading that still holds up today. The story's fascinating, serving as the very first game in the Zelda timeline, and giving us the origins of the Master Sword. Seeing the world before it became the Hyrule we know as a fresh perspective, and the relationship between Link and Zelda in this game is one of the most heartfelt in the series. The dungeons are also excellent, full of clever mechanics and some of the most creative boss fights in 3D Zelda. And while the game may be linear, it doesn't stop it from being engaging. You also get one of the most athletic versions of Link, capable of sprinting, climbing, and even wall jumping in ways that made the gameplay feel more dynamic. This likely inspired Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, as those games basically featured this Link on steroids. So yes, Skyward Sword has its problems, but it's still a very strong entry in the franchise. And thanks to the Switch remaster, many of its biggest issues, like the motion controls, have been improved. It's not my favorite 3D Zelda, but it's still a great game that deserves recognition, and honestly, I can see why someone might have this as their favorite if they prefer this style. Number 9, The Legend of Zelda, Minish Cap. Who would have thought that one of the very best 2D Zelda games wasn't even developed by Nintendo themselves? Minish Cap was actually made by Capcom for the Game Boy Advance, and it remains one of the most underrated gems in the entire franchise. This is the second game on the official Zelda timeline, serving as something of an origin story for elements like the villain body and even the Force Sword, but what makes Minish Cap really stand out is its central gimmick, the ability to shrink down to the size of an ant using the magical Minish Cap itself. Your companion Eslo, who doubles both as a quirky character and a gameplay mechanic, suddenly everyday objects become gigantic landmarks, and simple creatures like bugs or raindrops turn into legitimate hazards. It's a brilliant concept that's woven into every dungeon, puzzle, and corner of the overworld, and also gives off Pikmin vibes. Visually, this game is gorgeous, at least to me, because I've always loved the GBA graphics. The GBA's hardware allowed for some of the best sprite work in Zelda history, with vibrant colors, expressive animations, and detailed environments that still look great today. From lush forests and charming villages to the intimidating dark Hyrule Castle, Minish Cap takes full advantage of the handheld's power to create one of the most beautiful 2D Zelda experiences ever, and I actually like how this looks more than the DS titles, even though it's graphically more advanced. Gameplay-wise, it's really fun. The combat is smooth, the dungeon design is fantastic, and the puzzles make clever use of Link's shrinking ability. The Gust Jar, Cane of Patchy, and other unique items give it its own flavor while still feeling unmistakably Zelda. The soundtrack too is criminally underrated, with cheerful overworld tunes and atmospheric dungeon themes that really stick with you. The only real knock against it is its length. It's a bit shorter than other Zelda games, and there's never been a remake or remaster to bring it to a wider audience. It's been ported since, but that's it. It's a game that feels like a hidden treasure in the series. I don't have many criticisms, I just prefer the scale and ambition of the games that come later on the list. Still, if you've never played Minish Cap, do yourself a favor and track it down or just play it on the Switch, because it's one of the finest 2D adventures Link has ever had. Number 8, The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past. When people talk about the greatest video games of all time, A Link to the Past almost always comes up, and for good reason. Released on the SNES in 1991, this game was nothing short of revolutionary, and to this day it remains a masterclass in 2D adventure design. This is the game that defines so much of what we think of as Zelda. It introduced staples like the Master Sword, Kakariko Village, Lake Hylia, and even musical instruments as key items. Its story expanded the mythos of Hyrule, giving us more depth and atmosphere than the NES titles could ever provide. It set the stage for the future of the franchise, while also being incredibly fun and accessible in its own right. What makes A Link to the Past so timeless is the balance between freedom and structure. You start off with clearer goals, but there's always room to explore, discover secrets, and approach challenges in different ways. The dungeons are some of the best in the series. Each one feels distinct, with clever puzzles and memorable bosses. And then, just when you think you've beaten the game, the Dark World is revealed, essentially doubling the size of the adventure. That second world mechanic was mind-blowing at the time, and it's still one of the greatest twists in gaming history. The atmosphere is another standout. From the haunting, rain-soaked opening sequence at Hyrule Castle to the ominous landscapes of the Dark World, the game nails its tone at every turn, and the soundtrack, just legendary. Tracks like the Hyrule Field theme, the Dark World theme, and the dungeon music are etched into gaming history. There's a reason A Link to the Past is often compared to Ocarina of Time. It's essentially the 2D counterpart to the game's revolutionary impact in 3D. Even now, more than 30 years later, it's as enjoyable as ever. Nintendo pretty much set the gold standard for 2D Zelda here, and almost every entry since has drawn inspiration from it. Now, as for why I only have it at number 8, it's simply because for the most part I prefer 3D Zelda games, as well as one more 2D game. I grew up playing 3D Zelda games, so that's probably part of why that's my preference. I know there's probably a 40-year-old commenting now about how this list is a joke because his favorite childhood game isn't number 1, but remember, this is all just personal preference, and if you're getting upset at a stranger's personal opinions of video games, that's more of a problem. Number 7, The Legend of Zelda, A Link Between Worlds. When A Link Between Worlds came out on the 3DS in 2013, fans immediately noticed how familiar it felt. That's because this game is essentially a spiritual successor to A Link to the Past, barring its overworld, its structure, and its overall vibe, putting its own fresh spin on it. The biggest new mechanic is the ability for Link to flatten himself into a painting and even move along walls. It sounds strange, but in practice, it completely changes the way you approach puzzles and dungeons. Suddenly you're slipping through cracks, walking along ledges, and seeing the world in a completely new perspective. It's one of those mechanics that feels so natural, you wonder why it wasn't part of Zelda sooner. Another bold change was how the game handled progression. Instead of finding items in dungeons, you can rent or buy them from Ravio's shop, giving you access to most of the tools early on. This opened up the adventure in a way that made it feel a lot less linear, allowing you to tackle dungeons in different orders. For a handheld game, it was a surprisingly flexible and modern design choice. Visually, the game is colorful and sharp, perfectly suited to the 3DS's capabilities. The music remixes classic Link to the Past tracks, while adding new ones that stand proudly on their own. Now, the story isn't as grand as some other Zelda titles, but it introduces great characters like Ravio and Hilda, who had an interesting twist to the usual Zelda format. My only real criticism is that at times it feels more like an upgraded remake rather than a truly new game. The overworld is so similar to A Link to the Past that it occasionally leans on nostalgia a little too heavily, but beyond that, this is one of the best handheld Zelda games ever made. A Link Between Worlds takes everything great about A Link to the Past and refines it for a new generation. It's polished, creative, and endlessly fun. Reminder of how strong Zelda's 2D entries can be even in the modern era. I do go back and forth a lot with my rankings. I've had A Link to the Past higher and even Minish Cap higher at times, but for now I have A Link Between Worlds at 7. Number 6, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. If The Wind Waker was Nintendo at its most whimsical and playful, Twilight Princess was the exact opposite, Zelda at its most grounded and cinematic. After fans complained about Wind Waker's cartoony graphics, Nintendo leaned into a more realistic art style, producing the darkest looking Zelda game to date. Released in 2006 on both the GameCube and as a launch title for the Wii, Twilight Princess remains one of the most ambitious games in the franchise. From the start, you can feel its tone is different. Hyrule is depicted as a land under the shadow of the Twilight Realm, with creatures that feel far more grotesque and intimidating than in previous centuries. Link himself takes on a more rugged, stoic role, and when he's pulled into the Twilight, he transforms into a wolf, a bold mechanic that gave the game an identity all its own. The Wolf Link sections, while divisive, added a layer of variety that really drove home the sense that this wasn't just another Zelda game, it was something darker, stranger, and more experimental, and also very 2000s. It wasn't my favorite part, but I didn't hate it either. The dungeons in Twilight Princess are some of the best in the series. Arbiter's Grounds, with its creepy desert ruins and that unforgettable boss fight against Stallard, is pure brilliance. Snow Peak Ruins flips expectations by setting an entire dungeon inside a dilapidated mansion, complete with yetis serving you soup between battles. Then there's a City in the Sky, Temple of Time, and of course the sprawling Hyrule Castle, all of which stand as proof that the dungeon design was at its absolute peak here. Combat also feels fantastic. This is the first Zelda to really emphasize cinematic combat, with Link pulling off finishing moves, parries, and brutal combos that made every battle feel satisfying. Riding into a battle on horseback against King Bulblin, or dueling Ganondorf one-on-one in a sword fight, are moments that cement Twilight Princess as one of the most cinematic entries in the franchise. And we can't forget Midna, easily one of the best companions in Zelda history. She starts as a snarky, mysterious figure, but evolves into a complex and sympathetic character with her own arc. Her dynamic with Link carries much of the game's emotional weight, and her reveal at the end is one of the most memorable in the series. It's not without flaws. The realistic art style, while striking, does give some NPCs an uncanny look. The pacing can be a little slow, especially in the opening hours, and some of the wolf sections drag on longer than they need to be, but overall, Twilight Princess is a masterpiece. It may have been born out of a fan demand for serious Zelda, but it stands on its own as one of the most complete, satisfying, and unforgettable adventures in the series. Number 5, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. If Twilight Princess is Zelda's epic, dark fantasy adventure, then Majora's Mask is Zelda at its most unsettling, surreal, and deeply emotional. Released in 2000, it was built in just under 2 years using Ocarina of Time's engine, yet it somehow turned out to be one of the most unique and ambitious Zelda titles ever made. What made Majora's Mask so special is its tone. While Twilight Princess is dark on the surface, Majora's Mask is dark beneath the surface. This is a game dripping with dread and mystery. The world of Termina, or Termina, however you want to pronounce it, is doomed. The moon is crashing down, and the citizens live in denial, panic, or acceptance depending on where you are in the 3-day cycle. The entire game is essentially built around this time mechanic, 72 in-game hours before Apocalypse, which you can reset over and over using the Song of Time. The system adds tension and urgency like no other Zelda game. Progressing often means carefully managing your time, knowing you might have to abandon your progress and start again from day one. But with every cycle, you also get to know the people of Termina more intimately. Their schedules, their fears, their hopes. You see them live, suffer, and in many cases come to terms with their fate. It's haunting, and it gives Majora's Mask a human weight that few games ever achieve. Then there's the mask. Sure, Ocarina of Time had a few optional masks, but here they're the foundation of the entire game. Transforming into a Deku Scrub, Goron, or Zora fundamentally changes how you interact with the world. Each transformation is a completely different playstyle, and each comes with emotional baggage tied to the fallen heroes whose spirits fuel them. It's a gameplay and narrative working together in a way that's rarely even seen today. Yes, there's only 4 main dungeons, but 3 of them, being Woodfall, Snowhead, and Stone Tower Temple, are widely considered among the best in the franchise. And while the Great Bay Temple carries that dreaded water dungeon reputation, it still is a step up from Ocarina of Time's. More importantly, the true heart of Majora's Mask lies in its side quests, helping Andrew and Kathy reunite, comforting Romani at the ranch, giving closure to wandering spirits. It's these stories that elevate the game beyond just dungeons and bosses. The soundtrack adds to the atmosphere, ranging from the bustling cheer of Clocktown to the eerie emptiness of Iconic Canyon. And those theories you've probably heard, like the stages of grief or Link being dead the whole time, only underline how thematically rich and open to interpretation this game is. For me, Majora's Mask is proof of how bold and experimental Zelda games can be. Built in less than 2 years, it still manages to be one of the most haunting, emotional, and unforgettable entries in the series. Whether Zeldas are about saving the world, Majora's Mask is about understanding it before it's gone. I could really mix and match the order of really any of the top 5 because they're all so great. Some days I feel like Majora's Mask can be higher, but for now I'm going to put it at 5. Number 4, The Legend of Zelda, The Wind Waker. For a long time, Wind Waker was actually my favorite Zelda game, and even though it's dropped to number 4 on this list, it still holds a special place for me and for a lot of fans. Released on the GameCube in 2002, this was the Zelda that tried to be different. The first thing everyone notices is the art style. Nintendo took a huge gamble, going with cel-shaded graphics at a time when fans were expecting a gritty, realistic follow-up to Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. The backlash was loud, people mocked it as cartoon Zelda, but here's the thing, over 2 decades later, the visuals still look incredible. Where early 2000s realistic graphics have aged poorly, Wind Waker looks timeless. The bright colors, expressive character animations, and cel-shaded art style give it a personality that no other Zelda game has. And the irony, the same cartoon look people once criticized became beloved, even inspiring Breath of the Wild's softer art direction. But Wind Waker isn't just about looks, it plays wonderfully too. This was at the time the most expansive Zelda game ever made. Instead of sticking to one mainland Hyrule, you sail across a vast ocean with islands, each with its own secrets, characters, and treasures. The sense of freedom was unmatched, and until Breath of the Wild came along, this was Zelda at its most open and adventurous. The sea may have seemed empty to some, and it definitely was at times, but the music made up for it. There was also the hidden treasures, sunken ships, and enemy outposts waiting to be discovered just beyond the horizon. The story too takes on a more personal touch. This time Link isn't just setting out to save Zelda or Hyrule, he's trying to rescue his sister, and that family-driven motivation gives the game a more emotional feeling. And Ganon, he's not the raging monster we saw in Ocarina of Time. Here he's more reflective, more humanized, and surprisingly complex. Without spoiling too much, let's just say his motivations and final moments in the game hit very differently than in other Zelda titles. The supporting cast is also fantastic. Tetra, who's one of the strongest and most charming companions in the series, makes her debut here, and the King of Red Lions you're talking about is surprisingly endearing. Unlike other companions, Fi, he's never intrusive, always helpful, and full of personality. The dungeons, while fewer in number, are distinct and memorable, with clever designs that really lean into the game's mechanics and environments. Now, I won't pretend it's flawless. Sailing can get tedious, especially in the original release where charting the seas meant a lot of downtime. The HD remaster on Wii U fixed this brilliantly by speeding up sailing and streamlining the infamous Triforce hunt near the endgame. That's why I always recommend the remasters as the definitive way to play. It keeps all the charm and fixes the pacing issues. At the end of the day, Wind Waker is a masterpiece. It's bold, it's one of the most unique takes on Zelda we've ever seen. Some will argue it's the greatest Zelda game of all time, and honestly, I wouldn't fight them on that. For me though, it just barely falls short of the next 3, which in my opinion took everything Zelda could be and pushed it even further. And I think this is the only Zelda game that had a character featured as the profile picture of an edgy 2016 YouTuber. Number 3, The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild. For some, this is the greatest Zelda of all time, and I have actually held that opinion at points. For others, it's one of the greatest games ever made. And I'll be honest, it was almost 2 on this list, but I went back and forth so many times when making this list because Breath of the Wild really is that special. Released in 2017 for both the Wii U and the Switch, this game marked a radical departure from what Zelda had been for over 30 years. Gone were the structured dungeons, linear progression, the go here, get this item, use it in the next dungeon formula. In its place, Nintendo built a massive, sprawling open world where you could do whatever you wanted, however you wanted, and it worked better than anyone could have imagined. The freedom in Breath of the Wild is unmatched. Right from the start, once you step off the Great Plateau, you can walk in any direction and just go. See that mountain way in the distance? You can climb it. The weird glowing shrine, you could glide over there and check it out. That enemy camp, you can sneak in, set their weapons on fire, blow up their barrels, or even just roll a boulder down a hill and wipe them all out. The game constantly rewards creativity, and the physics system allows for solutions that feel natural rather than scripted. Makes you feel like you're truly adventuring, not just following a checklist. And the world itself is breathtaking. Hyrule has never felt so alive. The landscapes are stunning, from snowy mountains to desert dunes, grassy plains to dense forest. There's always something to discover, whether it's a hidden shrine, a Korok puzzle, or a massive Lionel ready to ruin your day. And it's not just big for the sake of being big, it's dense with meaningful interactions. Everywhere you go, there's something worth exploring. Now, that's not to say the game is flawless. The biggest complaint, and what really holds it from being in the top 2, are the dungeons. Like, the Divine Beasts are cool in concept with their moving parts and mechanical puzzles, but they lack the personality and complexity of classic Zelda temples. There's nothing quite like a forest temple or Arbiter's Grounds here. The story too, while serviceable, isn't the series' strongest. It's told more through flashbacks than present-day interactions, and while Zelda herself has some great character development, the narrative doesn't quite hit the emotional highs of other entries. But here's the thing, that doesn't matter as much when the gameplay is this good. The moment-to-moment experience playing Breath of the Wild is just so fun, so immersive that you forget about those shortcomings. The survival mechanics like cooking, weather systems, breakable weapons, stamina management keeps you on your toes, but they never feel unfair. The challenge is real, but it's always conquerable with preparation and clever thinking. Armor and clothing add another layer of strategy. It's not just about looking cool. Different outfits protect you from heat, cold, electricity. Combine that with dozens of weapons, shields, bows, and runes, you've got endless ways to tackle any problem. And then there's the shrines. Over 100 bite-sized puzzle rooms that test your brain and reflexes in creative ways. Some are simple, some are clever, and collectively they're a brilliant way to spread Zelda-style puzzles across such a massive world. In many ways, Breath of the Wild feels like a modern-day reimagining of the very first Zelda on NES. You're dropped into a dangerous world with minimal guidance, told to explore, survive, and find your own path. That sense of mystery, discovery, and danger that defined the original is still here, but on a scale never before possible. Now, I can make a whole hour-long video just on this game, because there's just so much to talk about, but I'll end it like this. Breath of the Wild isn't just a great Zelda game, it's one of the most important games of the past decade that took a beloved series, tore it down to its foundations, and rebuilt it into something bold, new, and unforgettable. And while I'll explain why I personally put 2 games above it, make no mistake, this is a masterpiece that will be remembered forever. Number 2, The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Whenever the topic of the greatest Zelda game, or even the greatest video game of all time comes up, Ocarina of Time is almost always in the conversation. And a common counter-argument you'll hear is, oh, that's just nostalgia talking, or people only put it so high because it was revolutionary back then. But here's the thing, I didn't even play Ocarina of Time until I got it on my 3DS in 2014. It wasn't my first Zelda game, and I had no early childhood nostalgia attached to it, and yet, even coming to it late, it's still one of my favorite games. There's a reason this game is so highly rated, it's just one of the best designed games of all time. Released in 1998 on the N64, Ocarina of Time was the first 3D Zelda, and Nintendo absolutely nailed it, just like they did with Super Mario 64 for 3D platformers. But it's not about innovation. The game itself is a masterpiece in atmosphere, pacing, design. The way the world changes when you shift between young Link and adult Link adds depth and variety that few games have matched. The dungeons are still among the best in the series, like Forest Temple, Spirit Temple. Definitely not the one damn water dungeon, even though that was better on 3DS, although it certainly was still annoying. The puzzles throughout the game are seamlessly integrated into the world. Playing the ocarina itself isn't just a gimmick, it's a central mechanic that ties into exploration, story progression, and even character development. And speaking of the story, this is one of Zelda's finest. From Link's humble beginnings in Kokiri Forest to his climactic duel against Ganondorf at the top of his castle, the game perfectly captures his journey. Zelda herself has one of her strongest roles here, and characters like Saria, Darunia, and Nabooru are still beloved decades later. The time skip twist, where you go from child to adult and see the world corrupted under Ganon's rule, remains one of the most memorable moments in a video game. Of course, you can point out that the graphics are dated or that the controls feel clunky compared to modern games, but to me, that's like criticizing the original Star Wars movies for not having today's CGI. It just misses the point. This was a product of its time, and it pushed the medium forward in ways few games ever have. And if the N64 version is tough for you, the 3DS remake fixes almost all of those issues, giving you a smoother, more accessible way to experience it. For me, Ocarina of Time is number 2 because while there is one Zelda game I feel pushed the formula even further, this is still one of the greatest achievements in gaming history. It's not just a great Zelda game, it's a cultural landmark. If you've never played it, do yourself a favor and pick up the 3DS version at least. There's a reason people still talk about this game over 25 years later. It's just that good. I know there's probably a 10-year-old snarkily writing how Ocarina of Time is bad and is overrated and shouldn't be this high, but I just don't care. And at number 1, we have The Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom. Here it is, the top game in the Zelda series, at least in my eyes. You don't have to agree. Tears of the Kingdom doesn't reinvent the wheel the way Breath of the Wild did, but what it did is arguably just as impressive. It takes one of the greatest games ever made and somehow made it bigger and deeper, quite literally. The most obvious addition is the Sky Islands. Exploring floating ruins above Hyrule gives the world the verticality few games have ever had. Think about the biggest open worlds you've played in that are handcrafted. Can't think of another I've played that actually has a whole new map right above you. But Nintendo didn't stop there. They also added the Depths, which is an entire underground world as big as the overworld itself. That's 3 layers of Hyrule stacked on top of each other, crafting one of the most ambitious and dense open worlds ever crafted. Sure, it may not be as densely packed as some other games, but it's very rare you'll go more than a couple minutes without finding something interesting. Then there's the new abilities. Ultrahand is the star of the show, and it completely changes how you approach puzzles, combat, and traversal. You could build bridges, vehicles, flying machines, basically anything you can imagine. It turns the player into a creator, giving you freedom in a way no Zelda game has ever before. Recall lets you manipulate time on objects. Fuse allows you to combine weapons and items kingdoms in creative ways, and Ascend turns ceilings into opportunities. H-Power feels revolutionary in its own right, and together they make Hyrule feel like a giant sandbox. One of the biggest complaints about Breath of the Wild was the lack of traditional dungeons. The Divine Beast all looked and felt too similar. Tears of the Kingdom does fix that. Without giving too much away, the dungeons here are much more distinct, with unique themes, designs, and bosses that make them feel like a true return to form. Now, it's not exactly the same as the classic Zelda dungeon formula, but it's much closer, and it strikes a balance between modern freedom and classic structure. The story too is a step up from Breath of the Wild, and while the non-linear nature of the game makes it tough to deliver a tightly woven narrative, Tears of the Kingdom still manages to tell a tale of ancient legends, rising threats, and personal stakes. And the sheer amount of content is just unbelievable. Between shrines, side quests, building, exploring the depths, discovering new sky islands, upgrading gear, and just messing around with the Ultrahand, it's the kind of game you can sink hundreds of hours into without running out of things to do. To me, that's why Tears of the Kingdom earns the top spot. It doesn't just repeat Breath of the Wild, it expands it in every direction, addressing its biggest criticisms while giving players even more freedom to play their own way. It took 4 years from announcement to release, and every bit of that wait was worth it. If history has taught us anything, it's that Nintendo takes its time with Zelda games, and that patience always pays off. And while it'll probably be close to 2030 before we see the next 3D entry, if it's anything like this one, the wait will absolutely be worth it. So for me, Tears of the Kingdom is the ultimate Zelda experience, and that's why I have it at number 1. And that's the ranking. So this video took a very long time to write, record, and to edit, so if you did enjoy, subscribing, liking, and commenting would really help me out. And you probably disagreed with this list, but I want to hear your list in the comments. Tell me what games you like, what games you don't like, and all I ask is that you keep it respectful to other people sharing their opinions. There's no one ultimate opinion. Someone could like something about a game you dislike, and vice versa. This is all just for fun, and it's not that serious. All it is video games. And with that being said, I do hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching Domainy, and I'll see you next time.